Greetings, this is Mr. Nobody. Doesn't matter who I am, it matters what is said, because it stands on its own merits and can be readily checked against the standard historical references. I'm calling this the beginning of a series of what I call the MAGA Republican. MAGA as in Make America Great Again. Yeah. The Republican Party has revivified by Donald Trump. But let's get a little background, because the Republican Party got its start in a rather interesting point in history. We start, in fact, with President Lincoln. He was the first Republican, as far as we know. I don't know if there were any other of the same party in lesser offices. I don't know that off the top of my head, but he was certainly the first presidential Republican, and that's pretty much about when the party started. Before that, there had been a couple other parties of some interest. Let's briefly review about three of them that are of interest. In the beginning was the Federalist Party, and then there was also kind of, we could call it an anti-Federalist party. Now, both of these parties expressed two basic conflicting directions. The Federalists wanted to create a strong central government and were the driving force between this country's transition from the original Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. So, because the Articles of Confederation were just a bunch of independent nation states that could pull together if we had to fight a war together, which, in point of fact, when that document was being provided and signed and so forth, we were in the midst of the Revolutionary War. That was all finished, and within a few more months, we finish and win the Revolutionary War, after which we are no longer under the thumb of George III of England, the King of England, or any further kings of England. We are our own country. And it did well enough for that, because all that was really needed at that point was to just get ourselves from, free country or free land. But it was kind of realized that there's definitely a strong case for central government, and that's where the Federalists came in. But with central governments, especially as they get more powerful, becomes more and more concerns. When everything gets centralized, you can't address local concerns as well. You could be corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Fortunately, George Washington, he certainly took the power as its first president, but he very painstakingly avoided any status of trying to make himself a king. He didn't want to be just another king. We didn't overthrow the British king just to have another king of our own who, however noble I may be, some successor could be just as bad as George III, or even worse. So, but there were also the anti-federalists who, though they kind of recognized we do need to be the one country, and have a structure similar to ours, we also kind of need to make sure it's the individual states still have their distinct ways and governments and so forth, with a very clear, substantial voice in a lot of things, and as many things as possible, other than the bare minimum of what it takes to hold the country together. And both of these kinds argued it out, debated it all out. You can read it all in a book called The Federalist Papers. And you can see all the different reasons for every little detail in the original Constitution. One of the great things, the American Constitution isn't a human creation, but it's probably one of the very much more impressive human creations I think there are. One of the best things about it is that it was known that this great effort is by no means claimed to be perfection. This is not divine revelation from on high, perfect, flawless. You don't dare tweak it if you you just don't dare tweak it. This is a human production. We've done our best. We've debated these details out. We've honed it out as best we can. Are there things we missed? Are there oversights? Are there stuff we probably could have, would have, should have handled, or maybe drilled into that we didn't, or maybe even handled differently? differently? Absolutely. So, I mean, we have the local tribesmen. How do we relate to these people? We had the Negro slaves. How do we deal with these people? There were a lot, and of course, each of the different states had some ways to relate to each other. And we have a president, and we have a vice president. When they first conceived it, they could be of different parties. Yeah. So something happened. The vice president is one party and doesn't like what the president of the other party is doing. Secretly has him assassinated, and now you're president, and now the whole country changes direction. So an amendment took care of that. And now the word amendment shows one of the great things about the Constitution. It can be amended, hopefully for the better. I can think of at least one amendment that, however well intended, clearly did not work out. It was the one that established prohibition. So bad that another amendment was needed to basically revoke that one. So, again, at least even though the amendment process was for the worse in that case, the same process enabled the situation to right itself eventually, after causing about a decade or more of gangsterism and all the other stuff that it wasn't intended, but it's what happens. It's the natural effect of these sorts of things. So it can overall kind of get better, get tweaked, a lot of things. And that's what it's done over the years. It started with the Bill of Rights, which is another very basic foundational document. So all of these things, which gave us the first 10 amendments to it. So these are very important. And the rights were rights of the people. They were rights that the federal government cannot take away from anybody, and even the states couldn't take them from the people, but anything not called out in there, the states could do. That's all part of how that works. But most of the Constitution had to do with, we're going to have these 3 different parts of the government. We're going to try to make them as independent as we can. There's no way to do this absolutely. So we had the Congress, which was split into 2 parts. We had the executive, which is one guy and his assistants, the cabinet as we now call them. And we had the judiciary, all the Supreme Court and all the other courts under it. And so by having these, trying to get these as independent as possible, they can keep each other in check, and no one group could just take over and run everything. Good stuff. But every man should be free. That goes back even to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal before their Creator. Entitled to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Well, somebody had to figure this out. Do we count a slave as a man? That was actually a question. I mean, we look at it now and like, he's a human being. Of course he's a man. He's entitled to everything everybody else is. But back in the day, that was a question. There were a lot of people that had heavily vested reason in saying they're not really quite human. They're kind of subhuman. Well, that had to be settled the hard way. And Lincoln had a very big role in that. Because another party that came along, we call it the Democratic Republican. It eventually became the Democrat Party. Okay. And actually, it had some decent figures. I think Thomas Jefferson did all right. And I think there's others. But in fact, it's kind of seemed to be the party. And, the Whig kind of shows up briefly, but they're kind of don't go much of anywhere. But the thing was, they also had people like Andrew Jackson. Now, I'm kind of related to him slightly. I come from a part of his bloodline, his family, not himself personally, though. He's in the family tree somewhere. I got a nephew that looks like he could just walk right off a $20 bill, but point is, he's in the family tree somewhere. All the same, and he was a great military person. I will give him that. But some of the things he did, especially in connection with the Indians and so forth, was really wrong. Just plain wrong and sick. Yeah, and Daniel Boone was famous for trying to stop some of that. Good on him. But all of that was just kind of, they didn't do anything about the slavery. They just, you had some people who wanted to be abolitionists, but they really had nowhere to go and gather themselves. That was one of the things the Republican Party wanted to do. You couldn't solve slavery in one fell swoop, but you could, start making important and incremental changes that will hopefully lead to the point where truly every man is equal, certainly before the law, and hopefully, in fact, in terms of we are equal to our own choices. And that's our choices we're talking about, not equal to circumstances that are out of our control. So he did what he could. He did a lot of good stuff. And he's very famous to this day, and I think with considerable justification. So the Republican Party started out as a reform. We're reforming this country. We got to stop this slavery thing. Even though we can't shut it down, we got to slow it down. That was one thing. We fought a civil war over that. But there was another thing he wanted to do, which I think was also important, and I'll be developing this in later segments as well. He wanted to hold the country together. The South didn't want to conquer the North. They just wanted to go their own separate way, be their own separate country. You can have your non-slavery, and we'll have our slavery. We'll all get along just fine. And you look at their money, and it says 2 years after the ratification of a peace treaty between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America, the Confederate States of America will pay their on demand however much money it was. They really thought that the things would come in such a pass. They really expected that. So the other thing that Abraham Lincoln had to do was to try to hold the country together. That's got to be like herding cats, and he did it. And that was, that's the awesome brilliance. We do it all, not just piecemeal. We should not be the ones seceding. Well, I'll get to that later on. Well, a lot of other history goes on. A lot of water under the bridge. The whole Reconstruction era was not much of a reconstruction, if you ask me. I think it was more of a, further destruction, and just people wanted to gouge everybody else for something or other. The North wanted to gouge the Southerners for trying to leave or for being slave owners. The Southerners wanted to gouge maybe the Northerners somewhat, but they also wanted to gouge the slaves for suddenly not being their slaves anymore. And it was a mess. But we were slowly picking ourselves up. And then there was, of course, all the explorations out in the old Wild West. And California was, gold and, all this good stuff. So that kind of distracted us, I think, in a way, and helped kind of draw attention away from the other desires to clobber each other. But meanwhile, the Republicans had gone from pretty much a reform party to being able to say, well, we've done our big stint. We've fixed the problem. Well, sort of, but we still had a long, long ways to go. And actually, worse, the Democrats weren't asleep either. They created do a little thing of their own to kind of further their stuff. And they created the Ku Klux Klan. So I think we didn't really move forward, and did we Republicans do much about that? Well, nowhere near enough, if anything. I have to admit that. What had happened? By the time you're getting past, say, President McKinley or so, like say up to Calvin Coolidge or Warden Harding and so forth, Republicans had become pretty much a conservative party. It's like, we've done our bit, we've helped the country, now it's a good country, let's just keep it the way it is. And I find it interesting, in those days, a lot of those northeastern states, all, Maine and Delaware and New Hampshire and Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, all that part was so solidly Republican. Like now it's so solidly Democrat. Go figure. But, they were the establishment party. They really had become establishment. And I think in that they kind of lost their original vision. They weren't too bad, but they weren't much good anymore either. So the Democrats kind of keep shifting around. After Ku Klux Klaning doesn't do much help, they switch over to, well, let's start offering these things to these people here. That made them think, well, I'm going to vote Democrat, even though I know they gave us the Klan, but because they're going to help me get some food for my family or some such thing. So they won some of the black community that way back in the 30s and 40s. Then, but the real, and people were starting to realize that needed to be done. Truman did. Truman was, I like Truman. I think he was a good guy. I won't call him perfect by a long stretch, but he's the kind of Democrat that you have to say he's an American, and I respect that. And of course, Eisenhower's all the more so. Now we're getting into the area of the civil rights struggle and so forth, and that was good because there was still a lot of stuff going on that should not have been going on, and nobody really seemed all that interested in doing anything about it. So for a while there, it looked like the Republicans were going to be respected for this and so forth. But then the Democrats took over. Well, by the time we get up to Reagan, we've got two kinds of Republicans, and they're still with us today. But back in the Reagan days, the difference between them was mild enough that they could work together pretty easily. You have the conservatives who just want to keep things the way they are, and things could use some improvements, and maybe in some ways that would have been probably their main weakness too. And then you also had the more active Republican. That was a relative minority at the time. They were the ones who would want to try to accomplish some good things, but they were outnumbered. But at least they could keep the country on an even keel, and they did. And the country profited and prospered with the leadership of Ronald Reagan. Bush never really understood Reagan's economic plan. Things didn't go as well, so it was kind of inevitable that it was time to give the other party a chance. And Bill Clinton was a name to us. We didn't know enough of how he ran the state of Arkansas to think otherwise. So why not give him a chance? Well, he mellowed out. But as time goes on, now after 8 years of Bill Clinton, and then now we're seeing Al Gore really getting pretty more virulent. See, Bill and Hillary. Hillary was the real leftist radical. And Bill was kind of more the good old boy. He was obviously much influenced by Hillary, but he was also willing to play ball and be kind of among the good old boys that will kind of keep some of the things going. And so actually, between that and a Republican Congress for the first time in decades, apparently, actually the 90s turned out rather well. So, okay. But we all knew that having Al Gore in there would not be a good thing. Running against him was Bush. Now, Bush is totally part of the, let's keep everything as it is, even if it's not working. We don't care. We just want to keep the status quo, and we're not going to do anything. Lame duck, sitting duck, whatever you want to call it. Well, we'll be non-MAGA Republican. As a result, in 2000, he so barely got it. Strictly speaking, he didn't even get a majority of the votes, but the electoral system managed to work it out that he won by literally the narrowest of margins any president has ever won in this country. Real legitimate margin. So, but that was more of the rise of the other kind of Republican, because meanwhile, the Democrats weren't sitting still. They got back into Congress. They started doing a lot there. And they got the Abominator in there. And, I mean, this guy just comes in as an absolute stark raving communist. I mean, not a day went by of his administration that we didn't lose some freedom. Sometimes a big one, sometimes a little one, but barely a day went by that we didn't lose one or another of our classic American freedoms. And you could just feel the hands gripping your throat, stage by stage by stage, day by day. And yet, somehow, he managed to get another 4 years. We didn't want him. America didn't want him. How did he get it? But he got it. So, another 4 years of this, and we're being run into the ground. Oh, all this misery, all this poverty. This is the new normal. Get used to it. All the prosperity of the old days, that's over. That'll never be again. Just get used to the fact that we're going to disintegrate as a nation, and we're going to get poor, and it's going to be miserable, and you're just going to lose all the freedoms that once made this country great. That's fine. And and we just kind of started to settle into that. And now the next thing they were offering was Hillary, more of the Obama. I mean, in 2008, I can remember thinking, when it was Obama versus Hillary, I can remember thinking, I can't imagine looking to Hillary with relief. But, the Republicans had this guy's name always falls out of my brain in 2008 that, I'm sorry. I mean, whatever he endured as a soldier and all that, we can all respect that. But the fact of the matter is, he would never have made a good president. And he really didn't make a good congressperson either. I'm sorry. This is the fact. So, when it was Obama, we just had to brace ourselves for, we're on a bad track now. Well, again, we get a lot of Republicans in the Congress. Kind of slows him down a bit. He still can do a lot of stuff. Has so many executive orders. I mean, a couple orders of magnitude more than all his predecessors put together. That's saying a lot. And every one of these created some new little group or unit or outfit or group or whatever to do something to make life more difficult for people. And that's really what it was all about. It's just making life difficult for people. Imagine just having nothing you got to do but sit around all day long cooking up ways to make life difficult for people. They have that. So what happens next? Well, America doesn't want that. We've already had 8 years of it. We shouldn't have even had those 8. But, at the middle of it all, what was our alternative? Romney? Not really. But, come on. A Hitler clone with his finger up his nose could have defeated Obama in 2012. How is it Romney didn't? Well, he had his own copy of the Obama Doesn't Care plan in his own state of Massachusetts. Now we want him to run the country? How is that different? I think that was probably a big part of it. Well, at any rate, so 2012 went the way it did. 2016, then Trump announces. Well, part 2, I'm going to have to talk about Trump. Thanks for listening.